Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one nobody notices until it's too late to look away. The red-eye flight from Chicago to Seattle had settled into the kind of quiet that only came after midnight. Cabin lights glowed amber above rows of half-sleeping passengers, and the soft hum of the engines blended with the distant clink of ice in plastic cups. Most people were staring at screens or resting with their heads against the windows, but a few were still awake, stealing glances toward the woman in seat 2A. Victoria Sterling was impossible not to recognize. Even at 38,000 feet, even dressed in a simple navy sweater instead of a tailored executive suit, she carried the unmistakable presence of someone used to being the most powerful person in every room. CEO of Sterling Dynamics, billionaire, business icon, magazine cover regular. The woman who had built a struggling company into one of the most respected technology firms in America. Yet tonight, she looked different. Tired. Not physically tired alone, but weary in a way money could never fix. 3 rows behind first class sat Ethan Brooks, 42 years old, single father, janitor. His work boots were polished but old. His jacket had been repaired twice at the elbow. A folded drawing from his 10-year-old daughter Lily peeked from the pocket of his carry-on bag. He wasn't thinking about billion-dollar companies. He was thinking about making it home in time for Lily's school presentation on Friday morning. The flight attendant dimmed the cabin lights even further. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight. Victoria rubbed her eyes. She had spent the last 72 hours moving between meetings, negotiations, and crisis calls. Every time she closed her eyes, another problem seemed to appear. Another demand. Another expectation. Another reminder that thousands of employees depended on her decisions. Across the aisle, 2 passengers whispered, "That's Victoria Sterling." "No way." "Yeah. Look at her." Victoria pretended not to hear. She had become accustomed to curiosity. What she had never become accustomed to was loneliness. 20 minutes later, turbulence gently rocked the aircraft. Nothing serious. Just enough movement to shift sleeping passengers in their seats. Victoria tried reading. She tried answering emails. She tried staring out the window. None of it helped. Exhaustion finally began winning a battle she had fought for years. Her eyes closed once. Then again. Then a third time. Meanwhile, Ethan had already drifted into a light sleep, his arms folded comfortably. The flight continued through the darkness. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria's head slowly tilted. A few inches. Then a few more. Before anyone realized it, the most powerful woman on the plane had fallen completely asleep with her head resting gently on the shoulder of a man she had never met. A quiet gasp came from somewhere across the aisle. One passenger lowered his tablet. Another lifted a phone. Someone else exchanged a stunned look with their spouse. The contrast felt almost unbelievable. A billionaire CEO sleeping peacefully against the shoulder of a janitor wearing work boots. Yet Ethan didn't move. He didn't push her away. He didn't wake her up. He simply remained still, respectful, calm, like a man who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness required no words at all. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. For the first time in years, Victoria Sterling slept without interruption. No calls, no meetings, no expectations, just silence. And somewhere between the steady rhythm of the engines and the darkness outside the window, she found something she had almost forgotten existed. Peace. What neither of them knew was that by the time the plane landed in Seattle, one small moment of quiet humanity would begin a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. The aircraft touched down just after 6 in the morning beneath a blanket of gray Seattle clouds. Rain dotted the windows as passengers stirred awake one row at a time. Overhead bins clicked open. Seat belts snapped loose. The quiet spell that had settled over the cabin during the night slowly disappeared beneath the sounds of a new day beginning. Ethan Brooks opened his eyes and immediately noticed the weight resting gently against his shoulder. For a brief moment, he looked surprised. Then he simply smiled to himself. Victoria Sterling was still asleep. Not the careful, guarded woman the world saw on magazine covers. Not the executive who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations. Just a tired human being who had finally found a few hours of rest. Around them, several passengers noticed the scene again. Some exchanged amused glances. Others whispered behind their hands. Ethan ignored all of it. He remained perfectly still until the aircraft reached the gate. The captain welcomed everyone to Seattle. That announcement finally stirred Victoria awake. Her eyes opened slowly. Confusion crossed her face first, then realization. She straightened immediately. "Oh my goodness," she said quietly. "I am so sorry." Ethan shook his head. "No need to apologize." Victoria glanced away, clearly embarrassed. "I cannot believe I did that. Looks like you needed the sleep." For the first time in what felt like years, Victoria laughed. It was soft and genuine. Not the practiced smile she gave reporters or investors. An actual laugh. "That obvious?" she asked. "A little." The line of passengers began moving toward the exit. Victoria gathered her things while Ethan waited patiently. She looked as though she wanted to say something more, but could not quite find the words. Eventually, she offered her hand. "Thank you." Ethan shook it politely. "You are welcome." Their eyes met for a brief second. Something about the exchange felt unusually sincere. No titles, no status, no expectations, just gratitude. Then the crowd carried them in separate directions. Ethan followed the stream of travelers through the terminal. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. Outside the enormous windows, rain streaked down the glass in silver lines. He stopped near a seating area to check his phone. 3 missed messages from Lily. 1 photo, 1 voice message, 1 heart emoji. Ethan smiled immediately. The photo showed Lily holding a stack of note cards for her school presentation. The voice message was even better. "Good morning, Daddy. I hope your flight was okay. Do not forget you. Promise to be home before Friday. Love you." Ethan listened twice before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Some promises mattered more than anything else. He reached into his jacket to retrieve his boarding receipt and felt something unexpected. A folded piece of paper. His brow furrowed. He unfolded it carefully. Written in neat handwriting were only 2 sentences. "Thank you for giving me the first peaceful sleep I have had in 3 years." Beneath the message sat a phone number. No company logo. No title. No mention of who she was. Just a name. Victoria. Ethan stared at the note for several seconds. Travelers rushed past him carrying luggage and coffee cups. Announcements echoed through the terminal speakers. Somewhere nearby a child laughed. Yet for a moment, everything seemed strangely still. He folded the paper again and slipped it into his wallet. Most people would have called immediately. Most people would have seen opportunity. Ethan Brooks simply picked up his carry-on bag and headed toward baggage claim. He had no idea that the small piece of paper now resting beside a photograph of his daughter was about to change the course of both their lives. By the time Ethan Brooks pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, the rain had settled into a steady drizzle that painted the world in shades of silver and gray. The building was nothing special. 3 stories. Faded brick. A cracked basketball hoop near the entrance that had seen better days. But to Ethan, it was home. He grabbed his duffel bag, locked his aging pickup truck, and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The moment he opened the door, a blur of brown hair rushed toward him. "Daddy!" Lily launched herself into his arms before he could even set down his bag. Ethan laughed and hugged her tightly. "Hey there, kiddo. You made it." "I promised I would." Lily grinned proudly. "I finished my presentation. I knew you would." The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla. A batch of cookies cooled on the kitchen counter. School papers covered part of the dining table. Everything about the small space reflected a life built carefully, one day at a time. Nothing was luxurious. Everything mattered. Ethan unpacked while Lily followed him from room to room, talking about school, her teacher, and a science project that involved growing bean plants in paper cups. He listened to every word. He always did. Later that evening, after dinner dishes had been washed and homework had been checked, Lily sat cross-legged on the couch practicing her presentation. Ethan listened from the armchair nearby. "Public speaking is scary," she admitted halfway through. "Only because you care about doing well. What if I mess up?" Ethan smiled. "Then you keep going. People remember courage more than perfection." Lily thought about that. Mom used to say something like that. The room grew quiet for a moment. Ethan glanced toward a framed photograph resting on the bookshelf. His late wife, Sarah, smiled back from a summer afternoon frozen in time. 7 years had passed, but some losses never completely stopped echoing. "She did," Ethan said softly. Lily nodded and continued practicing. When she finally went to bed, Ethan remained in the living room alone. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The clock above the kitchen read 10:43. He reached for his wallet while absent-mindedly organizing receipts from the trip. That was when the folded note slipped onto the coffee table. Ethan stared at it. The neat handwriting seemed almost out of place among grocery receipts and school schedules. "Thank you for giving me the first peaceful sleep I have had in 3 years." He read the words again. Then he noticed the phone number beneath them. Most people would have been curious. Some would have called immediately. Others might have searched the name online. Ethan simply folded the note and returned it to his wallet. His life was already full. Work started before sunrise. Bills needed paying. Lily needed rides to school and soccer practice. There was little room for distractions. Across the city, however, another person could not stop thinking about the encounter. Victoria Sterling stood alone inside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The skyline shimmered beneath the rain. Her phone buzzed continuously with messages from executives, attorneys, and board members. She ignored every notification. Instead, she found herself remembering something surprisingly simple. The quiet patience of a man who had asked for nothing. No recognition. No favors. No opportunity. Just kindness. Victoria walked toward the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. The note she had left suddenly felt foolish. Perhaps he had already thrown it away. Perhaps he had forgotten her entirely. Yet something deep inside told her otherwise. Somewhere beyond the city lights and the corporate towers, a story had quietly begun. Neither of them knew it yet, but the distance between their worlds was already becoming smaller than either one could imagine. The following Monday began like hundreds of Mondays before it. Ethan Brooks arrived at work before sunrise, coffee in one hand and a ring of maintenance keys in the other. Downtown Seattle was still waking up. Streetlights reflected off damp sidewalks, and the cool morning air carried the scent of rain and roasted coffee drifting from nearby cafes. Sterling Dynamics towered above the city skyline, 42 floors of glass and steel glowing faintly against the gray horizon. Ethan entered through the service entrance, nodded to the security guard, and started his routine. He preferred early mornings. Before meetings. Before crowded elevators. Before people filled the building with noise. There was something peaceful about restoring order to a place before the day began. He polished conference room tables, emptied recycling bins, and straightened chairs left crooked from the previous evening. Most employees never noticed. Ethan was accustomed to that. Meanwhile, 3 floors from the top of the tower, Victoria Sterling stepped out of a private elevator and immediately walked into a storm of expectations. The board wants updated projections. The investors moved the call to 11. Legal needs approval on the acquisition documents. Her assistant moved alongside her while listing the day's demands. Victoria listened carefully, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. It had happened several times over the past few days. In the middle of meetings. During conference calls. Even late at night. She would suddenly remember the quiet stranger from the flight. Not because of what he had done. Because of what he had not done. He had not tried to impress her. He had not recognized her influence. He had not asked for anything. In her world, that was rare. Very rare. Victoria, her assistant asked. Sorry, what was that? The acquisition review. Victoria nodded and continued walking. Yet something still felt unsettled inside her. Around noon, she left a strategy meeting earlier than expected and decided to walk through several departments without notice. She occasionally did this to stay connected with employees outside executive offices. Most people straightened immediately when they saw her approaching. Conversations became more formal. Smiles became nervous. Such was the effect of power. As she rounded a corner near the innovation wing, she noticed someone pushing a maintenance cart toward an elevator. At first, she barely glanced up. Then she stopped walking completely. Ethan Brooks looked up at the exact same moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. The busy hallway seemed to fade into the background. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Ethan appeared surprised but calm. You, she said softly. Ethan smiled. Good afternoon. Several nearby employees looked between them with visible confusion. Their CEO was speaking to a janitor as though she knew him personally. Victoria took a small step forward. You work here. Ethan glanced around playfully. Last time I checked. To her own surprise, she laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that rarely appeared inside corporate walls. I cannot believe this. Neither can I. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Employees continued entering and exiting, but neither seemed in a hurry to leave. Victoria folded her arms lightly. You never called. Ethan's expression remained thoughtful. No, I did not. Most people would have rushed to explain. Ethan simply told the truth. Victoria found that strangely refreshing. May I ask why? She said. Ethan considered the question. Because you looked like someone who needed peace more than another obligation. The answer landed with unexpected weight. For a brief moment, Victoria did not know what to say. No executive, no investor, no advisor had spoken to her like that in years. Before she could respond, her assistant appeared from down the hallway carrying a tablet and an urgent expression. Reality returned instantly. Meetings, deadlines, expectations. Victoria glanced toward Ethan one last time. Something told her this would not be their last conversation. Something else told her the distance between their lives was about to become much smaller than either of them expected. The encounter should have ended there. A brief conversation in a hallway. A curious coincidence. Nothing more. Yet over the next several days, Victoria Sterling found herself taking routes through the building she had never taken before. She reviewed departments she normally delegated. She attended meetings in conference rooms on floors she rarely visited. Officially, she was staying connected with company culture. Unofficially, she was hoping to cross paths with Ethan Brooks again. On Thursday afternoon, she got her chance. The cafeteria had already emptied after the lunch rush. Rain traced slow patterns down the massive windows overlooking downtown Seattle. The city appeared wrapped in a blanket of gray mist. Ethan sat alone at a corner table eating a simple turkey sandwich while reviewing a flyer from Lily's school. Victoria spotted him immediately. For a moment she hesitated. CEOs were not supposed to walk across rooms and join janitors for lunch. Then again, Victoria had spent most of her life following expectations. She was beginning to wonder where that had gotten her. Carrying a cup of coffee, she approached the table. Ethan looked up and smiled politely. Good afternoon. Mind if I sit? She asked. Ethan glanced at the empty chair. Looks available to me. Victoria laughed softly and took a seat. For several seconds neither spoke. Surprisingly, it was not uncomfortable. The silence felt easy, natural, something Victoria rarely experienced anymore. You always eat lunch alone? She finally asked. Ethan shrugged. Not always. Sometimes I have company. Who? He slid the school flyer across the table. Victoria picked it up. The front displayed colorful artwork and the words Spring Student Presentation Day. A photograph of Lily was clipped to the corner. Victoria studied the smiling girl. Your daughter? Ethan nodded. His entire expression softened. It was subtle but unmistakable. Lily, 10 years old. She has a presentation tomorrow. She looks happy. She keeps me that way. Victoria stared at the photograph longer than she intended. Something tightened gently inside her chest. She had spent years building a company worth billions. Yet she could not remember the last time she had spoken about anyone with that kind of warmth. You must be proud of her. Ethan smiled. Every day. Before Victoria could respond, another voice interrupted. There you are. A tall man in an expensive suit approached their table. His name was Brandon Pierce, Senior Vice President of Operations. Ambitious, polished, always aware of status. He stopped abruptly when he noticed who Victoria was sitting beside. Confusion flickered across his face. The board is waiting for you upstairs, Brandon said. Then his eyes shifted toward Ethan. Sorry, I did not realize you were busy. The tone sounded polite. The meaning underneath did not. Ethan seemed unaffected. Victoria noticed immediately. Brandon continued. We can discuss important matters later. The words hung in the air. Ethan calmly folded Lily's flyer and slipped it back into his pocket. He stood. Sounds like you have work to do. Victoria looked up at him. And you do not. Ethan smiled. Everyone's work matters. For a brief moment Brandon appeared uncomfortable. Not because Ethan had challenged him. Because he had not. There was no anger. No resentment. Only quiet dignity. Ethan nodded politely and left the cafeteria carrying his lunch tray. Victoria watched him disappear through the doorway. Then she turned toward Brandon. You know, she said calmly. Some of the most important people in this building do not work in boardrooms. Brandon forced a smile. Victoria gathered her coffee and stood. Deep down, something had shifted. For the first time, she was beginning to understand that Ethan Brooks possessed a kind of strength that could not be measured by titles, salaries, her corner offices. And somewhere beyond what he chose to show the world, she sensed there was a story he had spent years keeping hidden. The next morning began with sunshine breaking through the clouds for the first time in nearly a week. Golden light spilled across the glass exterior of Sterling Dynamics, turning the tower into a beacon above the city. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt far less bright. Rumors had begun circulating through executive offices. A major competitor was preparing a surprise product launch. Investors were asking difficult questions. Several board members wanted immediate answers. Victoria Sterling spent most of the day moving from one meeting to another. Financial reports covered conference tables. Forecasts filled presentation screens. Voices overlapped. Opinions clashed. Yet through all the noise, she found herself remembering a simple sentence Ethan had spoken in the cafeteria. Everyone's work matters. The words seemed unusually relevant now. Late that afternoon, Victoria stepped into an elevator after a particularly exhausting strategy session. She intended to return to her office. Instead, she pressed a different floor. The archives department occupied a quiet corner of the building rarely visited by executives. Shelves filled with historical company records stretched from floor to ceiling. Victoria approached the records manager. "I need information on a former consultant." The woman adjusted her glasses. "Name?" Victoria hesitated. "Ethan Brooks." Several minutes later, an old digital file appeared on the screen. Victoria expected to find maintenance employment records and little else. What she found instead made her stop breathing for a second. Ethan Brooks, former systems architect, former technology consultant, former innovation strategist. Victoria stared at the screen. There had to be a mistake. She opened another file, then another. More records appeared. Technical papers, development proposals, patent references, internal commendations dating back more than a decade. Ethan had not always been a janitor. Years earlier, he had worked with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Several foundational concepts used throughout modern cloud infrastructure carried his name in supporting documentation. Victoria leaned closer. The deeper she looked, the more astonishing the story became. Then she found the resignation notice. The date matched 7 years earlier. Around the same time, Ethan's wife had passed away. No explanation followed. No dramatic farewell. No attempt to negotiate a larger position. Just a quiet departure. Victoria sat back slowly. Outside the archive windows, evening sunlight painted the city in shades of gold and copper. Suddenly many things made sense. The calm confidence. The thoughtful answers. The complete absence of ego. Ethan had once possessed the kind of career most people spent their entire lives pursuing. Somehow he had walked away from it. Not because he failed, because he chose something else. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at Lily's school auditorium. Folding chairs filled the room. Parents chatted quietly while children prepared presentations backstage. Ethan took a seat near the front row. Lily spotted him immediately and waved enthusiastically. He waved back. Minutes later, she stepped onto the stage. Her hands trembled slightly at first. Then she remembered her father's advice. Courage mattered more than perfection. Slowly her confidence grew. By the time she finished, the audience applauded warmly. Ethan's eyes shined with pride. To him, nothing happening inside corporate towers could compare to moments like this. After the event ended, Lily ran into his arms. "Did I do okay?" she asked. Ethan laughed softly. "You did more than okay." Across the city, Victoria remained alone in her office long after sunset. The archive file still rested open on her desk. She stared at Ethan's photograph attached to an old employee record. The man pushing a maintenance cart through hallways had once helped shape technologies worth billions of dollars. Yet he never mentioned any of it. He never sought recognition. He never corrected anyone's assumptions. Victoria looked out at the Seattle skyline, glowing beneath the night sky. For the first time, she realized she was not merely curious about Ethan Brooks anymore. She was beginning to admire him. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of her office, events were already moving toward a moment that would force the entire company to see him the way she now did. Monday arrived with an unusual tension hanging over Sterling Dynamics. Employees felt it in the elevators. Managers felt it during conference calls. Executives felt it in every conversation that ended with more questions than answers. News had broken over the weekend that Nexacore Technologies, Sterling Dynamics' largest competitor, was preparing to unveil a platform that could threaten years of market leadership. Financial analysts were already speculating. Investors were demanding reassurance. By 9 o'clock that morning, emergency meetings filled nearly every executive conference room in the building. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of a long glass table surrounded by senior leadership. Charts covered giant screens. Forecast models flashed warning indicators. Concern showed on faces normally trained to hide it. Brandon Pierce paced near the windows. "We have a serious problem," he said. "If their launch performs the way analysts expect, we could lose major contracts before the end of the quarter." Another executive nodded. "Our response timeline is too slow." "Then make it faster," Brandon replied sharply. Victoria remained quiet. She listened carefully while arguments bounced around the room. Everyone seemed eager to prove expertise. Yet no one offered a solution capable of addressing the real issue. 2 floors below, Ethan Brooks pushed a maintenance cart through a hallway lined with innovation labs. The building felt different today. More rushed. More anxious. Employees moved faster. Conversations sounded sharper. Ethan had spent enough years in corporate environments to recognize pressure when it appeared. As he emptied recycling bins near a development department, he overheard fragments of conversation. Product delays. Infrastructure limitations. System integration concerns. The same words repeated again and again. He said nothing. By lunchtime, Victoria's frustration had grown. Meeting after meeting produced the same result. More discussion. More forecasts. Less clarity. As she walked through the innovation floor searching for a moment to think, she noticed Ethan replacing a light fixture near a conference room. "Busy day?" he asked with a small smile. Victoria laughed softly despite herself. "Is it that obvious? You have the same expression Lily probably gets before a difficult exam." Victoria folded her arms. "That bad?" "Maybe not that bad." For the first time all morning, she relaxed. They stood quietly for a moment. Rain tapped gently against nearby windows. Office lights reflected across polished floors. Then Ethan glanced toward a monitor visible through the conference room glass. Several technical diagrams remained displayed from an earlier meeting. His eyes paused on them for a second longer than expected. "Interesting approach," he said casually. Victoria followed his gaze. "You understand those diagrams?" Ethan shrugged. "A little." Victoria remembered the archive records. A little was probably the understatement of the century. "What do you see?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "You really want to know?" "I do." He stepped closer to the screen. His voice remained calm and unassuming. For the next several minutes, he pointed out inefficiencies nobody had mentioned during executive meetings. He identified bottlenecks hidden beneath layers of technical assumptions. He explained how certain systems could be simplified rather than expanded. The remarkable part was not merely that he understood the problem. It was how easily he understood it. As though he had already solved it years ago. Victoria listened without interrupting. Each observation connected perfectly to issues her executive team had spent days debating. When Ethan finally stopped speaking, silence filled the hallway. Victoria stared at the screen, then back at him. "How long would it take to implement those changes?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "If the right people work together? Maybe a few weeks." Victoria felt something shift deep inside her. Not surprise anymore. Certainty. The man standing before her was not simply intelligent. He saw solutions where others saw obstacles. Yet he carried that gift with complete humility. Before either could continue, Victoria's phone vibrated. Another emergency meeting. Another round of urgent discussions. She looked at Ethan for a moment longer. Somewhere inside the growing storm surrounding Sterling Dynamics, she had just discovered something her competitors did not have. What she had not yet realized was that very soon the entire company would discover it too. 2 days later, the largest conference room in Sterling Dynamics was filled beyond capacity. Executives occupied every seat. Department heads lined the walls. Large screens displayed market projections, system performance reports, and investor expectations. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain clouds drifted slowly across the Seattle skyline. Inside, tension hung over the room like a weight nobody could ignore. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of the table reviewing the latest reports. The news was not improving. Deadlines were shrinking. Competitors were gaining momentum. Several proposed solutions had already failed internal review. Brandon Pierce cleared his throat. "We need a decision today." Another executive nodded. "Investors are expecting answers." A third added, If we miss this window, the market will notice. Voices began overlapping. Charts changed. Opinions collided. Yet the room seemed no closer to a solution than it had been days earlier. Victoria listened quietly. Then she made a decision nobody expected. Before we continue, she said calmly, I would like someone else to look at this. The room fell silent. Brandon frowned. Who? Victoria pressed a button on the conference room phone. Could you please ask Ethan Brooks to come to conference room A? Several executives exchanged confused looks. Some assumed she meant an engineer. Others expected an outside consultant. Minutes later, the doors opened. Ethan entered wearing his maintenance uniform, a ring of keys hanging from his belt. He paused when he saw the room. You wanted to see me? Victoria nodded. Yes. Brandon looked genuinely bewildered. Victoria, this is a strategic board session. I am aware. Ethan remained near the doorway. If this is a bad time, I can come back later. No. Victoria replied. Please stay. The room grew even quieter. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The city beyond the windows seemed distant and muted. Victoria gestured toward the screens displaying the company's challenges. I would like your opinion. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One exchanged a skeptical glance with another. Ethan noticed, but showed no reaction. He simply studied the information. One screen, then another, then a third. The silence stretched. Finally, he stepped closer. May I? Victoria handed him the presentation remote. What happened next changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Ethan did not speak dramatically. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply began asking questions. Simple questions. Precise questions. Questions nobody else had considered. Within minutes, he identified assumptions buried inside months of planning. He connected departments that had been operating separately. He outlined a streamlined solution that reduced complexity rather than adding more of it. Every explanation was clear, logical, elegant. One executive leaned forward. Another started taking notes. Brandon stopped pacing entirely. As Ethan continued, people who had spent years in the industry found themselves listening with complete attention. The solution was not merely workable. It was better than anything presented during the previous week. When he finally finished speaking, the room became perfectly still. No arguments followed. No objections appeared. For several seconds, nobody spoke at all. Then an older board member slowly removed his glasses. Who exactly are you? He asked quietly. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Before he could answer, Victoria stood. Her voice remained calm. Years ago, Ethan Brooks helped design several of the technologies our industry still depends on today. Heads turned immediately. Shock appeared across faces around the room. Victoria continued. He walked away from an extraordinary career to care for his family when they needed him most. The silence deepened. People who had passed Ethan in hallways without a second glance now stared at him differently. Not because of titles. Not because of status. Because they were finally seeing the character that had been standing in front of them all along. Ethan shifted the remote onto the table. I should probably get back to work, he said softly. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. In a room filled with powerful people, the loudest sound was respect. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured across the Seattle waterfront, turning the water into ripples of gold beneath a clear afternoon sky. Much had changed during the previous 12 months. Sterling Dynamics had successfully navigated its challenges. New partnerships had flourished. Confidence had returned. Yet the most meaningful changes could not be measured in quarterly reports or stock valuations. Ethan Brooks still valued quiet mornings, still packed Lily's lunches, still believed character mattered more than recognition. Some things were too important to change. On a Friday afternoon, Ethan stood near the arrivals terminal of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, holding a small sign decorated with colorful marker drawings. Lily had insisted on making it herself. The sign simply read, "Welcome home." Travelers streamed through the terminal, pulling suitcases behind them. Voices echoed across polished floors. The scent of coffee drifted through the air. Beside Ethan stood Lily, now a little taller and noticeably more confident than she had been a year earlier. Do you think she will like the sign? Lily asked. Ethan smiled. I think she is going to love it. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared beyond the crowd. Victoria Sterling walked toward them carrying a travel bag over one shoulder. The moment she spotted Lily, her face brightened. Lily ran forward first. Victoria laughed and embraced her warmly. What began as friendship had slowly become something deeper over the course of a year. Not rushed, not forced, built patiently through conversations, shared meals, school events, and countless ordinary moments that quietly became extraordinary. Victoria looked toward Ethan. For a second, neither spoke. They simply smiled. Some connections no longer required words. Together they walked toward the terminal exit. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected. From passing cars and distant windows, the city felt alive, hopeful, at peace. As they reached a bench overlooking the drop-off lanes, Lily suddenly excused herself to buy a snack from a nearby kiosk. Victoria and Ethan found themselves alone for the first time that day. Traffic moved steadily in the distance. Airplanes crossed the sky above them. For a moment, neither seemed eager to break the silence. Then Victoria gently rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. Not because she was exhausted. Not because she needed escape. Not because life had overwhelmed her. This time it was different. She had found something she had spent years searching for without realizing it. A place where success did not matter. A place where titles disappeared. A place where she could simply be herself. Ethan glanced toward her and smiled softly. The same quiet kindness that had first caught her attention remained unchanged. Victoria looked up at him. "Do you ever think about that flight?" she asked. Ethan laughed. "Sometimes. It changed everything." Ethan considered that. Then he shook his head gently. "No, I think it revealed what was already there." Victoria understood exactly what he meant. Life had not transformed them into different people. It had simply brought two paths together at the right moment. A little while later, Lily returned carrying snacks and immediately squeezed herself onto the bench beside them. The three of them sat together watching airplanes rise into the afternoon sky. Around them, strangers hurried toward destinations. Announcements echoed through the terminal. Wheels rolled across concrete. Yet within that ordinary moment existed something rare. Peace. Real peace. The kind that cannot be purchased, negotiated, or earned through status. As the sun dipped lower over Seattle, Ethan wrapped an arm around Lily's shoulders while Victoria sat beside them. No boardroom applause could compare to this. No headline could capture it. Because sometimes the greatest victories arrive quietly. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones standing at the center of attention. They are the ones who offer dignity when others offer judgment, grace when others offer pressure, and kindness when nobody is watching. And in the end, that quiet strength was what changed everything.